jaja, le pinard, le pif. Il existe une ribambelle de termes pour désigner ce breuvage que nous aimons tant, le jus de raisin fermenté. Et c'est parce que nous l'aimons plus que tout que nous voulons mieux comprendre ce qui fait un bon vin. Cépage, climat et terroir y participent, mais avant tout, il y a la patte des vigneronnes et des vignerons. Je suis Romain.
Je suis Florian. Je suis Antoine.
Nous sommes 3 copains et nous vous emmenons à la rencontre de ces hommes et de ces femmes dans leur domaine pour les interroger sur la magie de leur métier et leur vie au milieu des raisins, des vignes et des barriques. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous dans le bon grain de l'ivresse.
The last 30 years, Australia has dramatically changed its position in the wine industry. Not only the production by volume has exploded, but their reputation has improved and several wineries have won international acclaim for the quality of their wines. Yarra Yering is one of them, and Sarah Crowe has a lot to do with it. As Yarra Yering winemaker and general manager, she has embraced the solid legacy of this estate, refining the practices, working on the details to produce among the best wines in Australia. She spent a few weeks in Paris last summer with her local importer, Gaëtan Turner from South World Wines. They offered me the chance to record the conversation I am sharing with you today. Enjoy, dear listeners.
I'm Sarah Crowe. I'm the winemaker and general manager at Yarra Yering Vineyards in the Yarra Valley, Australia.
Your story with wine is not that obvious. We met with this podcast a lot of people that are passionate with wine and their path through the wine industry was pretty clear, which is not exactly your story. Can you explain us how you started to be a winemaker, please?
Yes, it's not a usual story, I guess. I loved being outside and I liked working with plants, and so I was actually working in horticulture and selling plants. And then after travelling overseas, I was looking for a new job, and I thought one day that when I saw a vineyard when I was here visiting France, on my way home, I thought maybe I can work in a vineyard when I get back to Australia. So a little while later, I phoned my favourite vineyard and asked if I can come and work in their vineyard. And it was pruning season, so I went there to do some pruning and then went to help in the winery and accidentally became a winemaker. But I started in horticulture.
As you said, you accidentally became a winemaker, but you ended up in the two most famous wine region in Australia, Hunter Valley and Yarra Valley.
Yes.
Can you explain us, please, what are the specificities of this region and what are the wines, the styles of wines that are made in those regions, please?
Sure. Well, the Hunter Valley is considered a warm climate, warm temperate climate, and the varieties most common there are Semillon and Shiraz. They do also grow some nice Chardonnay as well, but most well known is for the Semillon and the Shiraz. And that's a warm region, I guess. Relatively high humidity. They would have dry winters, and their rainfall comes in summertime, so close to harvest. So it's a little bit of a challenging region in that way.
Yeah, it doesn't sound easy.
No. And then because I had worked there, it was considered, because it is, the Hunter Valley can be a difficult region sometimes. That was one of the reasons why when I interviewed for the job at Yarra Yering, that was considered good grounding because they had not long come out of the 2011 vintage in the Yarra Valley that was high rainfall and a difficult season. So, but typically the Yarra Valley is cool climate. It's not cold. It's not as cold as, say, Tasmania, but it's cool climate. We are a warm site within that cool climate region, and I guess most of our rainfall falls in winter and spring, typically. These things seem to be changing a little bit of late, but yeah, our rainfall is mostly winter, spring, and our summers are typically dry. So our challenging times in the Yarra Valley are in the growing season for things like mildew, that's the kind of difference between those two regions. Oh, and the varieties, actually. So, most people would know the Yarra Valley for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Those plantings happened in the mid-1990s. There was a big planting boom in Australia, and Domaine Chandon had come to the Yarra Valley to make sparkling wine. So that is why there's a lot of Chardonnay and Pinot. A lot of those vineyards are now made into table wine. But at Yarra Yering, our dominant varieties are actually Shiraz and Cabernet. So we grow a lot more red wine than white wine.
So we're going to talk about Yarra Yering, of course, but I want to talk a bit about Hunter Valley. In which kind of wineries did you work in Hunter Valley?
I was at Broken Wood Wines. That's where I actually started working in the vineyard. And I ended up being there for 9 years, ended up as the assistant winemaker there. And then I moved down the road to be the winemaker at one called Bimbadgen Estate, and probably less well known in the Northern Hemisphere.
What did you learn when you were in Hunter Valley? Why this region was a good start to be a winemaker?
I think it's largely that it's a wonderful wine community in the Hunter Valley, and those people, winemakers, viticulturists, really gather around somebody new, and they're very happy to share their experiences and their knowledge and educate and mentor young people. So, I had very little wine knowledge and experience before I went there. And it was, in particular, Broken Wood Wines was a very good, it's like an unofficial kind of wine university, I suppose, it's considered in Australia. So it was fortunate for me that I was there, where they opened so many wines and so many Australian industry icons come through and visit and share their wines and their experiences. So yeah, I would say that number one reason would be, the community there is still, so invested in bringing young people through in our industry. Yeah.
So working in horticulture and wine is not exactly the same?
No.
How did you convince people to hire you at the first winery?
It was, I made a phone call and I said, I'm a horticulturalist, I'd like to work in your vineyard. And the vineyard manager there, it was just I think the timing was right of that phone call. He must have just been thinking, gee, another set of hands for pruning would be useful. And I happened to call. And so, that did require me moving 3 hours away from where I was living and where my family were. But I did that, and I would drive up on a Monday and I would work all week, and then I would drive home on a Friday afternoon, and we did that for a number of weeks before I moved there. So it was just I'm a horticulturalist, I'd love to work in your vineyard situation. As we were leading into the next harvest, the 2002 harvest that was, another lady working in the vineyard just suggested to me that I should go and work in the winery for vintage, just because I'd get more hours and basically it was just to earn more money is why I went into the winery in the first place. But I would have to say that I think I've always been a very hard worker and very diligent, and that's a really valuable thing in a winery, is someone who's happy to get their hands dirty and particularly in harvest work the long hours. So I think at first it was just like, oh, she works hard, we'll keep her around for a little bit longer. Yeah.
And why did you decide to go back to school?
I think it was, I had done part of an arts degree as well, but I didn't see a career future in that for me personally. So I hadn't finished that Bachelor of Arts degree. And I think I'd studied horticulture. I just always felt like, eventually I'd find something that I liked so much that I really wanted to get a qualification in it. So yeah, I studied part-time. It's considered half of a full-time load, and we did this by correspondence, and we would travel to the university for residential schools, so intensive learning for a few days depending on the course.
Previously, you just raised a point about people saying maybe it's a good set of arms to prune in the vineyard. Nowadays, in France, for example, it seems that it's more and more difficult to find the people to work in the vineyard. Is the situation the same in Australia and especially in Yarra Valley?
Yes, it is a little bit harder to find young people coming through. It goes through phases. So I feel like at the moment I'm less concerned about future viticulturalists. We seem to have had a little bit of an influx of some great young people who are keen and interested. Who knows, we might go through another cycle where it seems difficult to find young people to help. But I think there's a curiosity and there's an interest in working with the land and food products, and I think this is something that young people are actually becoming more interested in, where their food comes from, how things are grown and made, and shopping locally, etc., etc. So I think that might be helping our industry in Australia.
In 2013, you started your journey at Yarra Yering. Why did you decide to leave Hunter Valley to go to Yarra Valley?
It was a really difficult decision. It was difficult to leave, but it was also easy to go because the reputation of the Yarra Yering vineyard, and I was so excited for that role, but I was also quite sad to leave the Hunter Valley. But I had started to consider, what my next career move within the Hunter Valley might be, and I really just didn't see a path to my next step in that region, which is why I had started to consider, if I'm not going to stay in the Hunter Valley forever, where do I want to be? Because in a way I had stumbled across the Hunter Valley, and lucky for me it was such a great region. But I decided that now this time I was, I could be more in control of my destiny. So where do I want to be? Where do I want to live? What wine styles do I want to make? And I very much liked medium-weighted wines, and the Hunter Valley makes medium-weighted wines as well. I wanted that cool climate, fragrant, medium-bodied, medium-weighted, fresh, lovely, fresh acidity in wines. These are the wines that I like to drink. And so I started looking at cool climate regions, and then the job at Yarra Yering was advertised, which is quite an unusual approach for such an iconic vineyard as well. But the owners wanted to put it out there and see who put their hand up instead. Many people just expected that they would, go and approach one or two kind of key people. But lucky for me, they decided to advertise.
Were you confident at that time that you could handle the job?
I was. I really was until I arrived. I was super excited. This is going to be great. And then, particularly in the Yarra Valley, there's a lot of the community there is quite protective and loves the Yarra Yering brand, and so people started to suggest to me, "Oh, it's a big job." The more people talked about it, the more I started to think, "Oh, what have I? Yeah, can I do this? And can I do it? And can I do it well?" So, but yeah, I think just going back to that, getting stuck in and having the kind of self-drive that I do, everything turned out okay.
What makes Yarra Yering iconic for you?
Well, it's a good question. I think our number one asset is our vineyard site, and sometimes it's hard to list three things that make it such an iconic site. The wines that have been made, even when the vines were quite young, the wines that were made back then, they have this amazing fruit power and ability to cellar and age so well that, you know, we have 50 years of looking at wines now that tell us that this is a very special vineyard as well. I mean, there are some other elements to the vineyard. It's a dry grown vineyard, so no irrigation. The soil there is it's very ancient and it's relatively kind of low in nutrients. So we're in the foothills, so we had good drainage, and but we also, you know, get good sunshine. All of these things just kind of add up to what we can see when we taste the wines, that it's a special place.
So the vines have been planted in 1969. First vintage is 1973.
Correct.
At Yarra Yering. And actually, in Yarra Valley, previous vintage made was 1923.
That's right. Yeah.
Can you explain us why there is this big gap of 50 years without wine produced in Yarra Valley?
Yeah. So some people will kind of tell some different stories about it, but as far as I know, Australia in the 1920s gone into economic downturn. At the time, they would have been making mostly fortified wine in that region. Economic downturn, the vineyards were returned to pasture or sheep mostly. And then, an even sadder fact, some people say that, after war there was less people to work in the vineyards, and I suppose less focus on making wine, and people were just kind of rebuilding their lives, I guess. Yeah.
You just mentioned fortified wine.
Yes.
So this explains why your iconic wines are called dry red wine. Number 1, number 2, number 3. Can you explain why you chose to call them dry, which can sounds weird?
It does, yeah. It's our founder, Dr. Bailey Carradis, was he was a botanist, but also an academic, and within Australia, throughout that previous to 1973, most of the wines made were fortified wine, and so really it was a very practical reason that he called the wines dry red wine, because he wanted to convey the message to the consumer that it wasn't a fortified wine, that this was actually a table wine. So it's just a very practical reasoning for the naming.
And you decided, Yarra Yering decided to keep the name even if almost nobody produce fortified wine anymore.
That was its name. That's what he labelled them in 1973, and then he just continued this system. And now we have a reputation, and people shorten the names a little bit. They will just refer to the number 1 or the number 2, and so that kind of makes it not quite a mouthful, and we all know what we're talking about. So we're too far now. We're too far down the track.
So we have a bit of noise because some people are cleaning the kitchen just behind us. I'm sorry about that, but let's keep discussing. So when people go to to the website of the winery, the first big idea they see is never rushed.
Yes.
Can you explain what that philosophy is?
I think it's an important philosophy for us that we take our time, and we do everything. We have a focus on being more precise than just getting the job done. It also helps us reference the fact that we don't release our wines as early as a lot of other producers. And in particular, for the export market, we like to cellar our wines a little bit longer again. So we hold the stock back because we don't want people to be, first of all, it's in production. We don't rush what we're doing. We take our time. We think things through. We consider our options. But then once the wine is in bottle, we don't want to rush the wine out to market. Because the wines are so well known as being very good cellaring options, it's a little bit of a reference to, the wines aren't going to fall over anytime soon. They stay youthful and fresh for a really long time. So the consumer also doesn't have to be rushed when it comes to enjoying the Yarra Yering wines.
What do you like to do with the wine of Yarra Yering? I mean, what do you like in the wine? How do you like them to be?
It's that, first of all, a beautiful expression of our site, but I also want them to reflect their growing season as well. We don't want every vintage of the same wine to look identical. We want them to feel the same, but they should represent the season with which they were grown in, so a cooler season, a warmer season. But I want them to be a beautiful expression of that vineyard. I try very hard to, even though I am the winemaker and I make a lot of decisions around the wines, I feel like I'm looking for a little bit of transparency in the wine. And if my hand as a winemaker is too heavy, then you don't see that detail in the wine. So I guess to sum that all up, I just want to make something that's really beautiful, but I want it to be reflective of where it's grown.
What do you mean by transparency?
I think it's the wines that we're making aren't super extracted. And so you can see this lovely detail in the wine. I guess I sometimes describe it as, they may be a little bit lacy. They're not heavy. They're not heavy wines, thick and soupy or very extracted in the extreme. But you can see the expression of the wine quite easily. You don't have to think too hard and look past the oak, for instance.
Would you say that this vision that you explain has changed since you started your job at Yarra Yering? And if yes, how did it change?
Yeah, definitely the wines have evolved in the 11 vintages now that I've made there. And a lot of that, we have these wonderful little small fermenters that Dr. Carradis designed and used in the 1973 vintage. So they hold roughly 600 kilos of grapes. They allow me to do a lot of experimentation and trial work to understand the blocks, the varieties, different techniques, production techniques, and how that impacts on the resulting wine. So I have this wonderful tool that I could really pull the wines apart in is one way of thinking of it. Pull the wines apart, trial lots of different techniques and thoughts, and then kind of put the wines back together again, working out which direction I think we should slowly evolve into. And then that requires investment in capital equipment and machinery, and to make these things easier. And maybe it's also things like trialing different vessels, which we do, just to work out what is the best way for us to make the most beautiful wines.
And can you explain us what never rushed means in the vineyard, please?
Yeah, everything in the vineyard, we do a lot of passes, foot passes with the vineyard team. It's a little bit of a reference as well to that we still handpick all of our grapes, which gives me way more options when it comes to processing the fruit in the winery. So in the beginning, throughout the growing season, it's foot passes, it's shoot positioning, it's crop thinning, it's making getting the balance in the vineyard when we're growing the grapes, and then when we harvest, hand harvesting, which is pretty slow and hot work as well. And then when we get into the winery, once we pick, we put them into a cool room overnight because it's usually pretty hot when we're during harvest. So we chill the fruit overnight, and then we process across a sorting table, and we can choose to bunch sort or berry sort. We can rearrange all of that equipment as we're going as required. If it's like this isn't working how I want it to, let's rearrange and try something different. And the little 600 kilo fermenters I was talking about, if we process, maybe a big day for us would be 8 tons of grapes to process, because we are sorting quite slowly. And then every 600 kilos of that 8 tons, we have to stop all the equipment, get a pallet jack, remove, squeak, 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 pump it up, remove that fermenter, drop it somewhere else, take the pallet jack out, go and pop it in another one, squeak, 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 pump it out, put that in under the equipment, and then we start everything again. So every 600 kilos, there's this break while we're just moving fermenters around. Every so often, I think there must be a quicker way for us to do that changeover of fermenters, but it's just how we operate now. That's 8 tons is a long enough day. We, as much as possible, we try and work around that as the season will allow us. Yeah.
So I think that everybody has understand what are the drawbacks of these small fermenters. What are the advantages then?
Well, it's the trial work. I think there's just being able to really do a number of different techniques on one batch of fruit. So I can start to build in layers and complexity into the wine through using different production techniques. That's one advantage, as well as the trial work. That trial work as well filters through from the vineyard. So if Andrew George, our vineyard manager, wants to do some trial work in the vineyard, it's easy for us to keep that separate with our small fermenters as well. What else was I talking about?
The advantages of the fermenter.
So the small fermenters, they are a lot of work. They take up a lot of floor space. We hand plunge them, which gives you a close connection to them, and often I am the one who does a plunging round most days, and it's very easy to see the fermentation and what's happening, and looking at the skins and the colour in them and how that fermentation is progressing. I really actually love doing that plunging round myself, because it helps me plan what's happening in the next few days, because I can see where the different fermentation stages are at, how the skins are looking, how they're feeling, when I think it needs to be pressed off skins. And you have it's a great way to be quite intimate, I suppose, with the fermentation, because it's very visual. There's another element to them, which is the ratio of skin to liquid, and the consistency that this is how the Yarra Yering wines have been made for 50 years as well. I don't know if when he designed these fermenters, if Dr. Carradus was considering the skin to juice ratio or not, but it's been consistent for 50 years, and I'm sure there's something in that as well.
You mentioned a lot of handwork at your winery for shoot positioning, for harvesting, for example. Are there common practices in Yarra Valley?
It can be, because it's a high rainfall region during spring, during the growing season. It is a high input region, and a lot of that is that footwork, the multiple passes that we do.
I'm sorry, but when you say high rainfall, can you give us a figure, please?
It's close to, the long-term average is about 850 millimetres.
Okay, which is pretty close to Bordeaux, for example, in France, something like this, yeah.
Yes, I believe so. The last few years, actually, we have had some years that are over a metre. It can also be quite varied across the Yarra Valley, just because of the landscape there and the way the prevailing weather comes and the foothills and hills tend to push the clouds around. We are considered to be in a range shadow where the Warramate Hills behind us often push the clouds around us. So often, in comparison, we would often have lower rainfall than some other vineyards in the Yarra Valley. But the last 4 years have actually been higher than average as well. So they've been particularly challenging. If you're not doing that intimate, detailed work in the vineyard, you're likely to have some mildew issues in the Yarra Valley. It's a high input region, yeah.
And with such a high rainfall, as you mentioned, footwork is important because I guess that the soil is pretty wet, and so it's very difficult to use the machine, tractors, to go in the vineyard.
It can be a real challenge, yes, yeah. It's can be very, very slippery out there. So often, yeah, it's not uncommon to see tractors bogged in a vineyard in the Yarra Valley, that's for sure.
So previously you mentioned that we can find a lot of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in Yarra Valley. This is not what you produce the most.
No,
okay.
Although we do produce them.
Yeah, you produce a bit, yeah. So yesterday I had the chance to attend a very nice tasting with your wines. Thank you very much again for that.
You are welcome.
And I tasted Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Chardonnay, Shiraz, Touriga Nacional, and other Portuguese grape varieties. Mataro, which is the name in Australia for Mourvèdre.
Yes.
How can you produce such a wide range of grape varieties?
Yeah, I can see how that can be a little bit mind-boggling, particularly when you're based in Europe and regions are very controlled in what they can grow. It's a wonderful vineyard site. We have this, so it's cool climate. We're warm site within that region. It just seems to work, and I think it could be fascinating, say in France, to consider, because in Australia we have no real regulation around what we can grow in our tons.
Yeah, there is no appellation or a protected designation of origin.
That's right.
So in France, we know a lot that appellation with the set of requirements that are linked to the appellation. And for example, in Burgundy, you grow Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Aligoté, and a bit of César in Chablis region, and that's it.
Yes.
Okay. In Bordeaux, we grow Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, blah, 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 which is not the case.
No.
In Australia, you can plant anything, anywhere.
We are free to do as we please. And so I know there's some changes happening, for instance, in Bordeaux, where considering climate change, they're looking at some other varieties that have been approved as well. So
from Portugal, for example.
Yes, that's right. So I think that it's possible for the regions that you know to grow one or two varieties, that they could also grow 20 varieties like we do. But there's been a lot of trial and error, I guess, over the years, and there's been varieties that have come and gone. And when they don't work, those varieties come out and something else gets planted. So in the very beginning, in 1973, Dr. Carrodus did say he didn't really know what was going to work, so he was just trying a lot of different things, and that, you know, he'd work it out eventually. So, yeah.
But I mean, when you hear about Touriga Nacional, for example, Shiraz and Pinot Noir, I mean, if you look, and Cabernet Sauvignon, if you look at where they are planted in Europe, they are planted in very different climate. Okay, so it seems a bit fascinating that you can make all those grape varieties in the same region. Does it mean that each of these grape varieties are planted in very different sites that have very specific climates?
There's not that much variation across our vineyard. The Portuguese varieties are planted on the highest, rockiest part of our vineyard, but there's not a great distance in say elevation from the bottom of the vineyard to the top of the vineyard. There's a little bit. We have these gravel bands, which we try to focus on, say, the Cabernet, where there's a little bit more rock in the soil, but it's, you know, it's maybe a fraction more, feels a bit more cooler or shaded where we've planted the Chardonnay, but it's not extreme differences across the vineyard. There are, I think, when we consider climate change, for instance, the Portuguese varieties may become even more important to us than they already are. But there are some other things we can do. I think also Chardonnay and Shiraz are very versatile varieties, and so if you look across Australia, they are grown in most regions all across Australia. And Australia is a really big country with lots of diverse climates, but we can grow particularly those varieties and just make different styles of wine. And I think that helps a lot. I think for the more tannic varieties, I think our site is very important, that we can achieve tannin ripeness. So the Cabernet, the Touriga, for instance, and that's where that cool site, but with warmth, is really important to achieve the tannin ripeness.
So it means that you harvest the different grape varieties at very different times. How long does the harvest last?
It will depend on the season. In some warmer years, our shortest harvest time has been about 4.5 weeks, and I think the longest has been 10 weeks. So it can vary quite a lot.
For 90 acres, that's it?
Yes.
Yes, which is, for French people, 35, 36 hectares.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's 2 vineyards side by side as well.
How many people do you need for the harvest?
Oh, for harvest, we bring people in to help with the picking of the grapes. Yeah, so depending on the weather, and if we're in a big hurry, then we get more pickers to come and help. But yeah, our vineyard team is 5 people throughout the year,
which is not that much for 90 acres.
No, we do get other labour in throughout the year as well if we need help. But we will do the very important things like pruning ourselves with our team, and then we use contractors to come in and pull the canes out and tie them down.
You blend a lot. I mean, for example, you have the range of wines that are called, as we say, dry red wine, number 1, number 2, number 3. Number 1 is a kind of a Bordeaux blend with Cabernet and Merlot.
Yes.
Number 2 is a Rhône blend,
yes,
with Shiraz mainly, Mataro, but also white grape varieties like Viognier and Marsanne. And the number 3 is the Portuguese blend. I'm very interested in your process of blending. How do you start to blend? Do you ferment separately the grape varieties? How do you work?
If we start with the dry red wine number 1, all of those varieties are fermented separately and matured separately, and that is probably the most stressful blending week in my calendar year. And that, because some of the varieties are quite limited, they can be quite easily put together. So we might only have 2 or 3 barrels of Petit Verdot, for instance. So as long as I'm happy with that, that goes into the blend. The Malbec is also a smallish component, usually maybe 10% in that blend. And I will typically use all of the Malbec, so that can go in. The Cabernet, as long as I'm happy with all of the parcels, I will put the Cabernet all together. And so the one that's left, the one where I very much hone the blend, is usually with the Merlot, and how much of that Merlot and where it fits in, and we have the most seamless palate from front to back. It's very stressful that week.
You said that you mature the grapes separately. I mean, the different grape varieties separately. So it means that you mature the grape varieties, and then after the blend, you mature also the wine. Why do you choose to mature separately? What's the purpose of that?
Well, a lot of it is I don't want to make those blending decisions when I'm busy and distracted, for instance, during harvest. It starts off as a practical decision as well, because of the different timing of the ripening of those. And we only have so many tanks and fermenters. So as we go through and press those grapes off, then we send them to barrel. So it starts off practically. This is the best way for the production flow in the winery. But then it also means that I'm not distracted and I have time. I have about 10 months of watching and tasting the blends to cement in my mind if I think they're good enough to go into the blend. And then we sit down and really take our time when we put that blend together. And then it will go back to barrel blended.
So does it mean that you try to make blend several times a year to be sure of what will be your final choice?
I do a little bit of that bench blending. So periodically we'll go through the different varieties and sample all the batches and just get the feel for them, and I make some notes and start thinking about right where I think they will end up at the end when we finish blending.
And when you mature separately, do you mature in oak already?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned Merlot. How do you like your Merlot? What is a good Merlot to be in the blend?
Oh, well, we do say that we have rubbish Merlot clones in Australia. I'm on a little bit of a quest to find a Merlot clone that I love. The original Merlot that we have, we don't know where the cuttings came from. Those records aren't in the office, so to speak. And we have trialled some other ones and trial it, give it kind of 6 years, take it out. Got another one in the ground at the moment. Merlot in Australia has been a bit of a difficult one. Occasionally, though, I will bottle a straight Merlot when I really love it.
But it's not today. No.
2019 was the last time I did that.
Okay. Do you work the same way for the other blend?
The dry red wine number 2 is a little bit more dynamic in that it will, throughout the year when we rack the barrels, I'm more likely to rack some batches together. And it might be that I have, in my career, I've had more experience with Shiraz than Cabernet or Bordeaux blends. So it might be that I just feel more comfortable and confident that those batches are going to end up together. So the Shiraz, the dry red wine number 2, happens a little bit more organically, whereas I really do kind of put my serious face on when it comes to the dry red wine number 1. The number 3 is a little bit different again because some of those Portuguese varieties are such a small amount that we co-ferment. It's like a field blend co-ferment. I can generally keep the Touriga Nacional and the Tinta separate, and the others tend to be kind of fermented and pressed off together, just because of the volume of them.
I would like to mention a specific blend that you have at Yarra Yering, which is Pinot Noir and Shiraz.
Yes.
How did you start to make this one?
It goes back to my roots in the Hunter Valley, where there was a famous winemaker there through the 40s and 50s, who it's commonly known and spoken about that he would always put a little bit of Pinot in the Shiraz and a little bit of Shiraz into the Pinot. And that was Maurice Ausha at Mount Pleasant. And I was lucky enough to have one of these wines one night that had come out of James Halliday's cellar. And I was invited to this dinner. And it was my wine of the night, and it was a Mount Pleasant, I think from memory now, it was a 1952 Hermitage. Stephen Hermitage. We used to love to steal French terms in Australia. And it was just so silky and, lacy and pretty and beautiful. And the conversation was, how much Pinot do you think is in this Shiraz? And in the end, it was like, it doesn't matter because it's just such a delicious wine. So that was on a Friday night. On the Monday, I went into work and I started playing around with blending some Pinot and Shiraz just to see how it looked. But I wasn't trying to make a wine that looked like a wine from the Hunter Valley. I really wanted to take that inspiration for that blend, very much for it to have a Yarra Valley feel. And so our blend is 50-50. That was the first blend that I tried on the bench was 50-50. And then I started to go, and look at the other percentages, and I always just came back to 50-50. And so that would have been very unusual for Maurice Ausha to blend a 50-50 wine.
How do you select the Pinot Noir and Shiraz that will be in that blend?
It happened, I was trying to, I was talking about pulling apart and doing some trial work in our small fermenters. And the Yarra Valley is quite famous for its use of, or it is now, for its use of whole clusters of bunches. And so I had a block of Shiraz that hadn't ever made it into, or in my time wasn't making it into the dry red wine number 2 blend. So to try and understand this block a little bit better, I thought, well, let's do some 100% whole cluster fermentation and see how that looks. So I had this very bunchy, fragrant, juicy, fleshy Shiraz component that after doing my trial work, it was so different that it still wasn't going to make it into the dry red wine number 2 blend. So I had already been thinking, I'm not really sure where this bunchy Shiraz is going to fit. And so in that, making the blend, but being very Yarra inspired, I decided to use that bunchy Shiraz. And then I just looked at the different Pinot batches that we had and to decide which one fit with that wine best. But it started with some experimental work on whole cluster ferment in Shiraz.
And what Pinot Noir fits with the fleshy and juicy Shiraz?
Well, we had, it was probably in the first year, it was the skinniest, the leanest Pinot that we had. So it still had the fragrance, but it didn't have the volume.
And with good acidity, I guess?
Yes, yeah. And it brought a real freshness. Kind of calmed the bunchy Shiraz a little bit.
So yesterday during the tasting, we started to have debate or discussion about cork and screw cap. You only use screw cap at Yarra Yering. Why
Yes.
did you make this choice?
My experience working in the Hunter Valley around particularly Semillon and its ability to oxidize so quickly that we had embraced the screw cap there. So I had a lot of experience with screw cap, and so for me, it's the best technical closure that we have to ensure that the wine is going to look correct.
But some people say that with cork, you have oxygens that helps the wine to age. But it seems that you don't want to have the contact with oxygen. Am I right?
Yeah, I think it's varying degrees of oxidation, not maturation, for me. And our Yarra Valley wines, there's a certain weight to those wines, and I think in bigger, richer areas, you can hide a little bit of that oxygen ingress because the wine was so fruity to begin with. But in particular with our wines from the Yarra Valley, I think it's much easier to see the influence of cork and how variable that can be.
Yesterday, I was pretty amazed about the texture of the tannins. I found them very soft, even for I would say the big wines, even with Cabernet, even with Shiraz, even with Portuguese grape varieties. How do you manage to get the tannins so soft?
I think when we choose harvest dates for red wine, it's, for me, of course, it's flavour and chemistry balance as well. But the most important thing is tannin ripeness. And then when we're processing, we're sorting out anything that's undesirable, underset, overset berries. So we never have small green berries in the fermenters, and we never have the raisined berries either, because these are discarded in our sorting process. So there's nothing particularly abrasive that makes it into the fermenter in the first place. And then our gentle extraction through hand plunging, our press is gentle. I think oak selection.
Yeah, I don't know what they do in the kitchen, but we have some weird noise sometimes. I'm really sorry about that.
No problem. I think oak selection and that the tannin impact that is very important as well. So we've transitioned from, heavier toasting in oak barrels to a lighter, longer toast, and I think that has helped as well.
How do you choose your barrels?
Well, in Australia, we have to place our barrel orders in October. So we're choosing oak before we've even, finished flowering sometimes. Very different to here in France where they just wait till they've pressed off and they're tasting their wine and then they go and order the oak barrels. So it's a really different situation that we're in Australia. It's I use a lot of different coopers, and it's part of that is it's like hedging your bets a little bit, because in some years, in a warmer year, a handful of coopers might work the best. If it's a cooler season, some of the other coopers that we use might really shine in that year. So part of using a lot of coopers is about it's a little bit of insurance in a way to make sure that we have a good balance in the resulting wine, because it is so far out from harvest.
And where are the coopers that you work with?
They're all French and from across, because we make Chardonnay, Pinot, Shiraz, Cabernet, and associated varieties. I'm buying oak from coopers all across France.
Nobody is in Australia to produce oak barrel.
There is some people in South Australia, and to be honest, one one Cooper did offer this this year, or not this year, 1 year offered to, like, we'll build the barrels, but we'll wait until you call us and tell us when you've got your fruit, and then we will fire the barrel, we will toast it and send it to you. So in maybe the comparison is coffee beans are roasted and toasted, and they are better fresh, although some people will say they're like there's a time there too where it's like 2 weeks after roasting. Coffee beans will be at their best, maybe not 1 or 2 days. But it was this idea of us having this try of comparison of what it might be like if you're so close to your Cooper. And so we got this freshly toasted barrel, filled it probably 12 days after it had been fired, and it was the worst wine I've ever made. So I think that we just understand barrels that are kind of 6 months old, and it's just what we're used to, and it's a whole different concept for us that I personally don't think I understand.
What's the rate of new oak that you use every year?
It changes with the wines. The dry red wine number 1 sits at about 40% these days. The dry red wine number 2, 30% is quite common for us. So it's somewhere between 25 and 40%.
And you mentioned the toast of the barrels. How did that evolve since you have been at Yarra Yering?
When I arrived in 2013, I just tasted through all the oak that had been used, and historically they were heavier toast and also toasted heads, and I already wasn't really a big fan of toasted heads, so that was the first change that I made when I arrived, and about a week later I had to order barrels for the next season. So it was that was a very quick decision, but then it was a kind of slow evolution of just trialing different things and seeing where I thought it sat better. As we upgraded equipment and invested in new ways of processing, that also requires a bit of a change in oak selection. So Chardonnay and Pinot I bottle within kind of 12 months before the next season. Historically, Yarra Yering had left those in oak for more like 18 to 20 months. So if you shorten your maturation time, you have to change your oak grain as well. So it's just a very slow evolution across the 10 years.
So climate change is everywhere. Is it a big challenge for you with the style of wine you want to produce?
Yes, it's something that I think about quite a bit. If we are reworking a block in the vineyard, for instance, most of our blocks originally run north-south. They wanted to capture as much sunshine as we could. So if we're reworking a block, then if we can, based on the slope of the site, we will change that more east-west or even on an angle to protect the fruit zone from the hot afternoon sun. We're trying to make sure we get good canopy growth and coverage. And then there's also selection of rootstock, which can help us grow a bigger canopy and help protect that sunburn or that early ripening, and there's lots of things that we're trying to think about in the vineyard, and then clonal selection as well. So, for instance, there's some Chardonnay clones that we've been working with that are much more mineral and citrus focused, and I think that will be the future. But yeah, rootstock can have a really big impact on the size of your bunches and berries, and that can help us keep the wines tighter and finer.
How would you like to make the style of your wine evolve in the future?
That's 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 a good question. I guess it's been evolving for 10 years, and I feel like we've got to a pretty good place. There's a few. I think there's some other varieties that we can try with that. You know, we're 50 years old now. What does the brand look like in another 50 years' time? So that's the way that Andrew in the vineyard and myself in the winery are thinking about, you know, what's it going to be like? What are the wine styles going to be? How do we mitigate this earlier harvest, warmer perhaps years? So yeah, we're working a lot with, say, cover crops and undervine cover crops and trying to keep the moisture in the soil some years. Not lately. We've had a lot of rainfall the last few years. You know, so we're very much working from the ground up to try and make sure that we can still be making these cool, climate elegant wine styles.
And in the cellar, what are the topics you want to focus on?
I'm looking at, you know, different kind of vessels and what we need to be thinking about, and I feel like I can't have a comment on things like ceramic eggs and amphora unless I trial them and have a go. So we're very much looking at what vessels we need to be using. I think we've got to a very good place with the sorting. I think my next in the cellar, the next thing that I really need to think about or want to think about is there's not a lot of refrigeration capacity in our cellar. We don't have a fridge plant. We don't go through a chiller. For instance, we don't have a must pump. And reflecting on an earlier question, the must pump, not having a must pump is probably also one of the reasons why we have such beautiful fine tannins as well. But focusing on refrigeration, particularly in our barrel cellar, to keep the wines bright and fresh if they're not getting too warm, because it's underground, but it's not as cool as it was, you know, when it was first constructed.
Regarding ceramic egg and amphora, did you taste wines that convince you that you should try those vessels?
Definitely the ceramic egg. I have a friend who was making Riesling in Tasmania, and when I visited her and tasted that, I thought it was really fascinating. So that's when I started. I got a couple of eggs.
What did you like in that Riesling specifically?
Just there's a real chalkiness and a texture, and I find I've used it on Chardonnay. I don't use them every year, but it's a seasonal dependent kind of decision. I love it, because we are a warmer site. It was very nice for giving us this kind of limestone chalky palate extension. So the same wine in barrels had this lovely kind of fullness and richness, and then to blend it with a little bit of wine from the egg, it gave a real palate extension and a freshness to the wine. So that's what I liked about the ceramic egg. We're only one season in with a couple of amphoras, and my plan didn't go according to plan with the varieties that went in there. So I wanted to put Touriga into that amphora, but the season didn't present. So we ended up with trialing as trial work again. Cabernet in one, Shiraz in the other, and there's this beautiful aromatics in those that have come from the amphora, and a different texture on the palate. So I've surprised myself, and I have actually bottled an amphora wine.
Sounds delicious. Yeah. Maybe I want to try it. Yeah. Yesterday we tasted wine which is called Agincourt. Can you explain us the name of that wine, please?
Well, the original vineyard planted in 1969, the naming of the blocks was very simple. Block 1, Block 2, and that flows through to the dry red wine number 1 comes from block number 1, and the dry red wine number 2 was sourced from block number 2. So, and then in 1990, Dr. Carradus bought the neighbouring property, so doubled the size of the vineyard. And all of those blocks he named... Well, he's a bit of a war buff as well, so just for some background, he would read a lot. And so each of those blocks are named after battles that the French lost to the British.
We can understand why Australian people have this link with the British ones. Yeah.
This is true. This is true. Yeah.
So, Sarah, I think it's time for the last traditional question here with Le Bon Grain de l'Ivresse. Are you happy at Yarra Yering?
Oh, I love it. And so I'm here visiting France. I've been on leave because I've been there for 10 years. So that's a long time. It's the longest job I've had. But I am in no way bored with my work, and we have lots of things to do still. So it's an amazing vineyard. I feel very privileged to be there and be making wine from it.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your warm welcome and for this fascinating insight into Yarra Yering. I am Romain Becker, and you are listening to Le Bon Grain de l'Ivresse. Post-production has been done by Emmanuel Nappey, thanks to Emmanuel Doré for the original music and to Lena Mazilu for the graphic design. Dear listeners, I hope you like this episode. Cheers!